Hi, my name is Jasmine, and I'm 27 years old. I'm speaking to you from my apartment in Chicago, a place I worked incredibly hard to call entirely my own. You know, they say home is where the heart is, but for a long time, my heart felt pretty misplaced, pretty undervalued. I was always the responsible one in my family. Maybe you can relate to that? The one who gets good grades, follows the rules, helps out, doesn't cause trouble. It feels good, at first, like you're appreciated, dependable. But sometimes being the responsible one means you're also the one they take for granted, the one they assume can just handle everything, including being overlooked. My younger brother, he was different. Charming, impulsive, always flying by the seat of his pants. He racked up about $40,000 in credit card debt doing typical young impulsive guy things, I guess. My parents? They swooped in like financial superheroes. Wiped the slate clean. No lectures, just relief. Their boy was okay. It was a crisis, yes, but it was his crisis, and they solved it for him, instantly. Less than a year later, I was facing my own kind of crisis. I was a grad student, juggling studies and a part-time job to make ends meet. That job disappeared unexpectedly. Funding cuts, nothing I did wrong. Suddenly, I was short on rent. Not $40,000 short, not even $4,000. Just a few hundred, needed for a couple of months to bridge the gap while I found something else. I swallowed my pride, something I was getting pretty good at, and asked my parents if I could borrow just a small amount. A loan, I emphasized. I'd pay them back. Their response was different, crushing. They told me I needed to learn independence, that this was the real world and I had to figure it out. The contrast hit me like a physical blow. $40,000 for my brother, instant bailout. A few hundred for me, a lecture on independence. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what it meant. About who they saw when they looked at us. It hurt more than I can easily put into words. I didn't argue though, I didn't scream or cry or beg. I just heard them. And I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. I hung up the phone, and in that moment, a quiet, steely resolve settled inside me. I decided I would figure it out, entirely on my own. And I did. It was hard, really hard, but I did. A little over a year after that call, I invited my parents over, not to ask for anything, not to yell or accuse. Just to have them sit in the apartment I had managed to buy and fully pay off through sheer grit and sacrifice. The apartment they had, in essence, told me I was on my own to secure. The silence that filled the room that day spoke volumes. And I want to share the story of how I got there, how I learned that sometimes, the greatest act of independence is realizing you don't need the approval or the rescue from the people who should have given it freely. Let me know where you're watching from, and maybe share if you've ever felt this kind of disparity in your own life. Growing up, I was the dependable one. It wasn't a title I was formally given, more like a role I gradually inhabited, like slipping into a coat that was slightly too big at first but eventually fit comfortably, even if it was a little scratchy. I was the older sibling, the quiet one who did her homework without being asked, who cleaned her room, who babysat my younger brother, Noah, without complaint. Noah was the whirlwind. Charming, impulsive, a magnet for scraped knees and minor disasters, but also for attention. Our parents worried about him, fussed over him, celebrated his small victories loudly while my larger, quieter achievements often went unnoticed or were met with a simple, "Well, that's good. Jasmine, we knew you could do it." It wasn't malicious, not overtly, it was just different. They saw Noah's struggles, his needs, his dramas. They rushed in to smooth his path, to cushion his falls. With me, they saw competence, they saw responsibility. And they interpreted those qualities not as something requiring support or nurturing, but as evidence that I didn't need support. I was self-sufficient, therefore I required less. It was a dangerous feedback loop. The more capable I was, the less help I was offered. The less help I was offered, the more I had to rely on myself, which only reinforced their perception. By the time I was in my early 20s, navigating grad school in Chicago, this dynamic was deeply ingrained. I worked 2 part-time jobs, cobbled together scholarships, and lived frugally. I was proud of my independence, genuinely so. I liked knowing I could handle things. But there was a quiet part of me that still yearned for the easy reassurance, the unquestioning belief, the safety net that Noah seemed to have automatically. Noah, meanwhile, drifted between jobs, pursued various fleeting passions, and generally lived with a cheerful disregard for practicalities like budgets or future planning. He was still charming, still the life of the party, and still very much the focus of my parents' anxiety and affection. Their calls to me were often prefaced with updates on Noah, His latest venture, his latest setback, their latest intervention. My own life, my studies, my work, felt secondary, a stable backdrop against which Noah's more dramatic narrative unfolded. The $40,000 debt crisis didn't explode out of nowhere, not really. There had been smaller financial situations over the years, help with rent, co-signed loans for cars he quickly wrecked or sold at a loss, but $40K was a different league. It was credit card debt, maxed out on travel, gadgets, nights out, things that left no tangible trace except the mountain of bills. I remember the frantic phone calls, the hushed tones, the genuine panic in my mother's voice. My father was angry, of course, but underneath the anger was that familiar parental fear for their vulnerable child. They called a family meeting. I drove home from Chicago, a 4-hour trip I could barely afford. We sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. Noah looked sheepish, appropriately contrite, but also strangely expectant. He laid out the numbers, the impossible interest rates, the collectors calling. It was bad, really bad. My parents listened, their faces etched with worry. Then, my father cleared his throat. "Okay," he said, his voice firm but lacking the usual edge of disappointment he reserved for me when I merely got a B instead of an A. "Okay, we'll handle it." My mother nodded, relief washing over her face. "It's a lot," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but we'll figure it out. We'll take out a second mortgage, whatever it takes." Noah's head snapped up. "You will?" he asked, a flicker of surprise in his eyes quickly replaced by overwhelming gratitude. "Oh my God, thank you. Thank you both so much. I'll pay you back, I promise, every penny." We all knew he wouldn't, or maybe they believed him in that moment. But I saw the relief flood his features, the way the weight lifted from his shoulders right there in front of me. And I saw the look on my parents' faces, not just worry, but a fierce, protective love that seemed to consume all else. They didn't ask how he'd managed it, not really. They didn't set up a strict repayment plan, beyond a vague, "we'll figure something out." Their priority was simply making the problem disappear for him, saving him. I sat there, quiet, as usual. I offered practical suggestions about budgeting, about selling some of his possessions, about getting a steady job. My suggestions were politely heard, then immediately dismissed as my parents circled back to their plan to absorb the debt themselves. It wasn't about solving Noah's underlying issues, it was about solving the immediate, painful consequence for him. I drove back to Chicago feeling strange, a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Relief that the family crisis was averted, I suppose, but also a dull ache. A sense of distance. They were ready to turn their lives upside down, take on massive debt, for Noah. It highlighted, in sharp, undeniable relief, the difference in our perceived needs, our perceived worthiness of sacrifice. Less than a year later, the rug was pulled out from under my own feet. The university funding for my research assistant position, which paid a significant portion of my rent and living expenses, was suddenly cut. It wasn't performance-related, it was a bureaucratic decision, swift and impersonal. I was given 2 weeks' notice. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. My savings were minimal, carefully hoarded for emergencies, but this felt bigger than a flat tire or an unexpected medical bill. Rent in Chicago wasn't cheap. I immediately started scouring job boards, reaching out to contacts, but finding a new position that fit around my demanding academic schedule wouldn't be instantaneous. I calculated my expenses meticulously. I could cover this month, maybe next, by draining my savings and living on instant noodles. After that, I'd be facing eviction. It was the hardest phone call I had ever made to my parents. I practiced it in my head a dozen times. I minimized the drama. I presented it factually. My job was cut. I was looking for another. I just needed a small temporary bridge. "Mom, Dad," I started, my voice feeling shaky despite my efforts. "Something's come up. My assistantship, the funding was cut. I'm looking for something new, but I'm going to be short on rent for maybe 2-3 months. Could I possibly? Could I borrow, say, $1,500? Just until I get back on my feet? I'll write up a payment plan. I can start paying you back as soon as I get a new job, even small amounts." Silence stretched on the line. Not the frantic, worried silence that preceded their bailout of Noah, but a different kind, a judging silence. Finally, my father spoke, his voice measured, heavy with what sounded like disappointment. $1,500, Jasmine? That's a lot of money. $1,500. It was less than 4% of the $40,000 they had absorbed without blinking. The comparison screamed in my head, but I bit back the instinct to voice it. "I know it is," I said, trying to keep my voice level. But it's just temporary. I have leads, I'm applying everywhere. I just need to make sure I don't end up on the street. It sounded dramatic, maybe, but the fear was real. My mother sighed in the background. Then she came onto the line. "Jasmine, honey," she said, her tone soft but firm, the kind of tone that preceded a lecture disguised as life advice. "You're 26 years old, you're getting your master's degree. You need to be independent now." I was actually 27, but the detail felt irrelevant in the face of the larger point. "This is about independence," I said, a desperate edge creeping into my voice. "It's about weathering a sudden setback. Everyone needs help sometimes." "But you're so capable, Jasmine," my father interjected. "You've always been so responsible. We raised you to stand on your own 2 feet. This is part of it, figuring out how to handle life's curveballs yourself." "Noah had a curveball," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The comparison was finally on the table, raw and uncomfortable. A $40,000 curveball. My father's tone hardened instantly. "That was different, Jasmine. That was a one-time crisis. He made a mistake, a big one, yes, but he's learning from it. He needed help getting a fresh start. This is just living. You need to budget better, have more savings. That's what being an independent adult is about." "Budget better?" I repeated, the words almost a gasp. "I worked constantly, lived minimally, saved every penny I could after expenses. I live off of practically nothing. I don't go out, I don't buy new clothes, I don't take trips. I work and I study, that's it." "Well, clearly it wasn't enough savings," my mother said, her voice losing its forced softness and becoming tinged with impatience. "Maybe you need to take on more debt yourself. Student loans? Can you get a credit card? That's how people manage these things when they're independent." Take on debt? My father, who had just bailed my brother out of catastrophic debt, was advising me to get into debt? The hypocrisy was breathtaking. "So," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm, "just so I understand. When Noah is in trouble, you step in immediately, no questions asked, absorbing all his debt. When I'm in trouble, through no fault of my own, you tell me to figure it out and take on more debt? It's not the same, Jasmine, and you know it," my father said, his voice rising. "You're responsible. Noah, he needed help. He's not like you. You can handle this." "Exactly," my mother added. "You're strong, you're resourceful, we know you can find a way." It wasn't a compliment, it was a dismissal. My strength, my resourcefulness, my responsibility, the very qualities they supposedly admired, were being used as justification to deny me the very thing they freely gave my brother: unconditional support. They didn't see my need because they were blinded by their narrative of my capability, a narrative that conveniently absolved them of any obligation to me. My responsibility wasn't a virtue to be rewarded with trust and reciprocity. It was a convenient excuse for neglect. The conversation continued for a few more painful minutes, cycling through variations of figure it out and be independent. There was no offer of a loan, not even a small one. No suggestion of brainstorming solutions with me, just the clear cold message: you are on your own. I didn't argue anymore. What was the point? They had shown me unequivocally where I stood. I thanked them, my voice flat and devoid of emotion, and hung up. I stood by the window of my small, rented apartment, looking out at the grey Chicago sky. The betrayal wasn't just about the money, or the lack thereof. It was about the fundamental difference in how they valued my brother and me. It was about realizing that all my efforts to be the good, responsible child hadn't earned me security or unconditional love. They had only earned me the right to be abandoned when things got tough, because surely, I could just handle it. The next few months were a blur of stress, exhaustion, and scraping by. I took on any odd job I could find: dog walking, freelance proofreading late into the night, selling plasma. I ate rice and beans until I thought I would turn into a grain. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, my mind racing with anxieties about rent, tuition, finding a job, and the gnawing pain of my parents' rejection. The emotional toll was immense. The carefully constructed image of my family, the one where we were a loving, supportive unit, shattered. I felt a profound sense of loss, a grief not for the money, but for the family I thought I had. I pulled away. I didn't call my parents unless necessary, keeping conversations brief and superficial. I couldn't bring myself to talk to Noah. The sight of him, the thought of his carefree debt-free existence courtesy of our parents, felt like a fresh wound. The silence from them was also telling. They didn't call to check in, to see if I'd found a job, if I'd made rent. It was as if, having declared me independent, their parental obligations had ceased to exist. The contrast with their constant hovering over Noah was stark and brutal. He was the perpetual child requiring rescue. I was the adult, fully formed and self-sufficient, no longer needing their attention or concern. During this difficult period, I did a lot of thinking, a lot of soul-searching. I replayed conversations, interactions, moments from my childhood and adolescence. The pattern was everywhere, subtle yet undeniable. Noah's report card needing extra attention, leading to tutors paid for without hesitation. My straight as earning a pat on the back. Noah needing a car for a new job, getting one bought outright. Me needing help with a down payment on a modest used car, told to save up myself. Noah's feelings being handled with kid gloves. My feelings being dismissed as overly sensitive or making a big deal out of nothing. It wasn't just about finances, it was about emotional energy, attention, validation. Noah consumed it effortlessly. I had to earn it, and even then, it was rationed. My role was clear: be good, be responsible, be quiet, don't need anything, and my value was tied to that role. When I suddenly did need something, when I stepped outside the box of the perpetually capable daughter, I was met with resistance and judgment. This realization was incredibly painful, but also, paradoxically, liberating. It was like seeing the bars of a cage I hadn't known I was in. The cage of their expectations, of their limited view of me. They didn't see Jasmine, the complex person with needs and vulnerabilities. They saw the responsible one, a convenient label that allowed them to justify their differential treatment of their children. The hurt began to morph into a quiet anger, and then into a fierce determination. Okay, they wanted me to be independent? Fine, I would be. More independent than they could possibly imagine. I wouldn't just survive this crisis, I would thrive, and I would do it without any help from them. The idea of buying my own place, of owning a piece of the city I loved, had always been a distant dream, something maybe possible in 10 or 15 years. But now, it became a concrete goal, a symbol of my absolute independence from their financial and emotional control. I redoubled my efforts. I found a new part-time job, less ideal than the last, but it paid the bills. I kept the proofreading gigs. I sold more plasma than I care to admit. I became an expert in finding free events, cooking cheap, nutritious meals, and walking everywhere to save on transportation. I applied for every small grant and bursary I could find. My social life evaporated. My focus narrowed to two things: surviving grad school and saving every single dollar I could spare. It was a grueling, lonely year. There were nights I cried from sheer exhaustion and frustration. Nights I wanted to call my mom, to just hear her say it would be okay, to offer some comfort. But I didn't. The memory of that phone call, of their cold dismissal, was a shield, a reminder of why I was doing this alone. Every sacrifice I made felt like a small act of defiance, a step further away from needing anything from them. I started researching affordable housing options, looking into first-time buyer programs. The idea of buying wasn't just about having a place to live, it was about creating a physical space that was entirely mine, uninfluenced by their expectations or control. It was about building my own foundation, literally and figuratively. After months of relentless work and saving, I found a small, perfectly imperfect condo in a diverse, lively neighborhood. It needed work, but it was mine. The process was terrifying and exhilarating. I navigated the mortgage application process, the inspections, the endless paperwork, all on my own. There were moments I wanted to call my dad, who was knowledgeable about real estate, but I stopped myself. I needed to do this entirely independently. This was the test. Closing day was anticlimactic and triumphant all at once. Standing in the empty rooms, holding the keys, I felt a wave of exhaustion and profound pride. I had done it. All the sacrifices, all the lonely nights, all the processed food, it had led to this. The initial mortgage was small, reflecting the condo's modest price and my substantial down payment built from scratch, but I didn't stop there. The drive to be completely free, completely unindebted to anyone, particularly my parents, fueled me. I kept working extra jobs, kept living frugally. Every spare dollar went towards the principal. I watched the balance shrink, faster than I ever thought possible. It became an obsession, a race towards absolute financial freedom. Just over a year after that devastating phone call, I made the final, lump sum payment. The bank representative on the phone sounded surprised. "Are you sure, Miss Miller? You're paying off the entire remaining balance?" Yes, I was sure. My hands trembled slightly as I confirmed the transfer. Receiving the official documentation a few days later, stating the property was mine, free and clear, felt surreal. I was 27 years old, a graduate student, and I owned my apartment outright. It was an achievement born from pain, yes, but also from an incredible reserves of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. Now came the difficult, necessary part. I knew I had to tell my parents, not for congratulations, not for validation, but to mark a boundary, to acknowledge the shift that had occurred. I didn't want a confrontation filled with yelling or accusations. I wanted something quieter, something that allowed the weight of the situation to speak for itself. I called them and invited them over for dinner. I didn't mention paying off the apartment. I just said I wanted them to see my new place, now that I was more settled. They accepted, sounding cautiously pleased. It had been a long time since we had spent relaxed time together. Cleaning and preparing for their visit felt like readying a stage. I didn't decorate elaborately, the space was still sparse, functional. But it was clean, it was mine, and it felt solid beneath my feet. They arrived carrying a small houseplant, a standard gesture. My mother looked around, her eyes scanning the rooms. "It's small," she said, the word hanging in the air, not quite critical, but certainly not impressed. "Cozy," my father added quickly, perhaps sensing my reaction. "It's exactly what I need," I replied, keeping my voice even. "And it's mine." We sat down for dinner. I had cooked a simple, nice meal. Conversation was stilted at first, revolving around neutral topics, their jobs, Noah's latest, the weather. They asked about my studies, my plans after graduation. I answered honestly, but without offering too much detail. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if observing this interaction from a distance. My mother, bless her inability to avoid sensitive topics, eventually circled around to finances. "So?" she began, picking at her food. "How are you managing everything, dear? Rent in the city is just astronomical. I don't know how you do it." My father nodded. "Yes, you must be struggling. We know that job cut was difficult. Have you found something more permanent yet?" This was it, the moment. I put down my fork and met their eyes. There was no triumph in my gaze, just a quiet certainty. "Actually," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I'm not paying rent anymore." They both looked at me, confused. "Not paying rent?" "What do you mean?" my mother asked. "Did you move? Is someone else paying? Are you living with someone?" The thought of me needing someone else to support me seemed to visibly worry her more than the idea of me being homeless had. "No," I said. "I mean, I bought this apartment, and I paid off the mortgage." The sentence hung in the air. My mother's fork clattered onto her plate. My father's eyes widened. Silence fell over the table, thick and heavy. It wasn't the silence of shock and awe, the kind you might expect after announcing a major achievement. It was the silence of discomfort, of cognitive dissonance, of a narrative being challenged in real time. They looked at me, then around the apartment, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile the struggling grad student they had envisioned with the person who had just calmly stated she owned her home outright. My father cleared his throat. You paid it off?" he stammered. "The whole thing?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Just finished paying off the mortgage last week." More silence. My mother picked up her napkin, fiddling with it nervously. My father just stared, his mouth slightly open. There was no warmth in their eyes, no joyous congratulations. Just awkwardness. "But how?" My mother finally managed, her voice hushed. Real estate is so expensive. We didn't even manage to pay off our house until you were in high school." "I worked," I said simply. "A lot. I saved everything. I lived very, very frugally. Every extra dollar went towards the principal." I didn't elaborate on the missed meals, the sleepless nights, the relentless anxiety that had been my companion for the past year. I didn't mention the phone call where they told me to figure it out myself. I didn't need to. The silence was doing the talking for me. My father recovered slightly. "Well," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's impressive, Jasmine. Very impressive. We always knew you were responsible." "Responsible enough to figure it out myself, you mean?" I asked, the question soft but pointed. He flinched slightly. My mother finally spoke, her voice a little strained. "Yes, dear, exactly. We knew you could, you see? We knew you didn't need our help, you just needed to push yourself." The twisting of the knife was almost breathtaking in its casual cruelty. They were trying to rewrite history, to cast their refusal to help not as abandonment, but as some kind of tough love test they knew I would pass. My struggle, my fear, my scraping by, all of it was reframed as a necessary part of my journey to the independence they had intended for me to find. They were taking credit for my resilience, the very resilience I had to develop because of their lack of support. I didn't argue. I didn't point out the hypocrisy. I just looked at them, really looked at them, and the profound sadness I felt was quickly overshadowed by a sense of clarity. This was who they were, this was the dynamic. Their inability to acknowledge the disparity in their treatment, to offer a simple apology, or even genuine, unalloyed pride in my accomplishment, without centering themselves or their narrative, was deafening. The silence returned, heavier this time. It stretched, filling the small apartment. It was the silence of unspoken words, of unacknowledged pain, of a fundamental disconnect that couldn't be bridged by a home-cooked meal or a potted plant. In that silence, I saw everything. I saw the years of favoritism, the emotional labor I'd performed, the ways I'd shrunk myself to fit into their expectations. And I saw my own worth, not reflected in their eyes, but solid and true within myself. They tried to make conversation again, commenting on the neighborhood, asking about my upstairs neighbors, anything to escape the weight of what had just been revealed. I answered politely, but my energy for performing the role of the agreeable daughter had evaporated. I felt calm, centered, detached. The need for their approval, for their retroactive validation, was gone. The silence was uncomfortable for them, but for me, it was a space to simply be, to inhabit my truth without needing their affirmation. They left relatively early, citing tiredness. Their goodbyes were awkward, the usual strained pleasantries. "It was nice seeing the apartment, Jasmine," my mother said, avoiding my eyes. "You've certainly been busy," my father added. There was no hug that lingered, no proud squeeze of the arm. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. The apartment was quiet, my quiet. The silence now felt different, peaceful, not heavy. I walked through the rooms, touching the walls, running my hand over the countertop. This space was mine. Every inch of it represented my hard work, my sacrifice, my refusal to give up. It wasn't just a building, it was a monument to my resilience, built on the foundation of their doubt. That evening marked a turning point. The visit wasn't the explosive confrontation I might have once fantasized about, where I listed every grievance and they tearfully apologized. It was something much more profound, a quiet declaration of independence, a reclaiming of my own narrative. I hadn't needed their permission to succeed, and I didn't need their validation afterward. The silence spoke louder than any argument could have. The relationship with my parents shifted irrevocably after that night. There wasn't a dramatic break, no slamming doors or angry ultimatums. It was a slow, steady drifting apart, a quiet redefinition of boundaries. I called them less often, and when I did, I kept conversations brief and emotionally detached. I no longer shared the details of my struggles or my triumphs. They had proven they weren't safe custodians of either. They occasionally mentioned the apartment, still sounding faintly bewildered by how I'd managed it. My brother seemed genuinely impressed, though perhaps also a little envious that I had achieved such stability while he was still navigating his own financial labyrinth. But the core dynamic remained. My parents continued to fret over Noah, to offer him assistance with whatever his current challenge was. And with me, they maintained a polite, distant respect, acknowledging my independence in a way that still felt like a justification for their past actions. I realized that they might never fully understand the depth of the hurt they had caused, or acknowledge the fundamental unfairness of their favoritism, and I stopped needing them to. My healing didn't depend on their apology, it depended on my own acceptance and my own choices moving forward. Setting boundaries became crucial, saying no to unreasonable requests, declining to mediate Noah's issues, limiting the frequency and duration of our calls and visits. It felt uncomfortable at first, a departure from my lifetime role as the agreeable, helpful daughter. There was guilt, of course, the ingrained programming kicking in. But with each boundary I held, I felt stronger, more authentic. I was no longer reacting to their expectations, I was acting in accordance with my own needs and values. My apartment became my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of my hard-won autonomy. I slowly furnished it, piece by piece, choosing things I loved, creating a space that felt utterly, unapologetically me. There was no timeline, no pressure. Each decision was a small act of self-care, a reinforcement of the fact that I was worthy of comfort, of beauty, of a secure place in the world. I finished my grad degree, found a good job, and built a life for myself in Chicago. A life that was stable, fulfilling, and defined on my own terms. The pain of the past didn't vanish completely, but it became a scar rather than an open wound, a reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. The betrayal had been a catalyst, forcing me to confront uncomfortable truths about my family and about myself. It had pushed me to rely on my own strength, to discover a resilience I might never have known otherwise. The silence in my apartment today isn't awkward or heavy like the silence that day my parents visited. It's a peaceful, quiet silence, filled only with the sounds of my own life, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant city noise, the beating of my own heart. It's the sound of freedom. The sound of being home, truly and entirely, in a place I built for myself, by myself. And in that silence, I finally found my voice. So, that's my story. It's still unfolding, of course. Life always is. But that period, that time of intense struggle and the quiet rebellion that followed, fundamentally changed me. It taught me that being the responsible one shouldn't come at the cost of your own well-being or your right to support. It taught me that some silences are louder than any words, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand in your truth and let others react however they will. I learned that the validation I craved from my parents wasn't something they were capable of giving in the way I needed, and I learned that the only validation that truly matters is your own. Believing in yourself, trusting your own judgment, and knowing that you are worthy of love and support, whether you get it from the people you expected it from or not. If you felt unseen, undervalued, or had to build your own safety net when you expected others to help, I see you. It's a painful place to be, but it can also be a powerful one. It can be the place where you discover just how strong you are. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider giving it a like. Subscribing helps me share more stories like this. And I'd genuinely love to read your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Have you ever felt like you were held to a different standard? How did you navigate it? Share your strength with us. Remember, your worth isn't determined by how others see you, or by what they give or withhold. It's inherent, it's yours. And you are capable of building the life you deserve, even from the ground up.